Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Jason Springs. I'm professor of religion, ethics, and peace studies here at the Kroc Institute, and today we'll be discussing a book that I just wrote and published a month or two ago entitled Restorative Justice and Lived Religion. So the format of the event will be as follows. I'll briefly introduce the panelists, and then I will offer very brief overview of the argument of the book, just so everybody it hasn't been out very long, not many people have access to it. So just a sense of some of the key terms and the central argument. Then we'll turn to the panelists who will each offer their presentation. And I'll offer just a few remarks in response to their wonderful comments and thoughts and challenges and things. And then we'll open it to the floor for questions and Q&A, which I'm very much looking forward to. And then after that, we will convene out in the atrium for a reception. So I'm eager to celebrate this occasion with all of you and so grateful for your attendance, as I am panelists. All right, so without further ado, Gwendolyn Purifoy is assistant professor of racial justice and conflict transformation in the Keough School of Global Affairs. She's an urban ethnographer. She spent several years conducting extensive field work in Chicago, Washington, D.C., and Newark, New Jersey, where she examines the lived experience of Black and Brown folks in public spaces, places, and neighborhoods. Her forthcoming book, Race in Motion, Public Transportation and Restricted Mobile Spaces, uses ethnographic and archival data to examine how public transportation is used to support persistent inequalities and inequities that are raced, spatial, material, social, and embodied. The book presents research that shows that although many of us think that public transportation exemplifies racial progress in the US, after all, Blacks no longer have to sit at the back of the bus. Nonetheless, public transportation continues to be a separate and unequal experience. David Kelly is a Catholic priest of the Missionaries of the Precious Blood. He's the executive director at the Precious Blood Ministry of Reconciliation, a community-based and community-led restorative justice hub in Back of the Yards, Inglewood community that began in 2002. Precious Blood works to accompany those impacted by violence and incarceration. It also strives to be a resource to other groups and communities who seek healing and reconciliation. For more than 45 years, he's worked as a chaplain in the Cook County Jail and Cook County Juvenile Temporary Detention Center. During that time, he has also worked in inner city parishes and ministry sites. Described to me distinctively and variously across my interviews across the city of Chicago as both a genius in restorative justice practice and community building, and also, quote, the toughest old white dude I ever met. Father Dave visited Notre Dame previously, perhaps most notably to deliver the 2017 dialogues on religion and nonviolence, religion and peace. Professor Connie Snyder-Mick is a senior associate director and the director of academic affairs at the Institute for Social Concerns at the University of Notre Dame, where she directs the Poverty Studies interdisciplinary minor. She teaches core courses for poverty studies, including perhaps most notably the course Poverty and Justice Inside Out at the Westville Correctional Facility with outside students from Notre Dame, Holy Cross College, and St. Mary's College, along with inside students who are correction staff or who are incarcerated inside the prison. Professor Mick is editor of the Journal of Poverty and Public Policy. Her research interests address the role of writing in social change, the rhetoric of poverty, and the pedagogies of community engagement. Her publications include Poverty/Privilege, a reader for writers, and a full argument rhetoric, quote, entitled Good Writing, an Argument Rhetoric. Her essay, Letting the Light In, exploring how poverty imprisons all of us in various ways, appears in the winter 2025 issue of Notre Dame Magazine. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our panelists. Wonderful to have you all here. Yeah.
Okay, well, I thank you, everyone. I'll make sure that I turn on. I want to get you all there. How's that? Good? Okay, thank you. Yes.
First thing I'm
Yeah,
supposed to do.
I was confused. I was like,
Thank you, Emmanuel. Appreciate that. I should have asked you to be master of ceremonies, obviously. So,
I was all confused.
Like, all right. So first, an overview of the book.
Thank you.
So all right. So just a quick overview of the key concepts. So we're kind of all on the same page. It's what is restorative justice? And in understanding kind of a thumbnail sketch of what restorative justice is, it helps to contrast it with the prevailing conception of justice in contemporary US society, which is retributive justice, or justice that is characterized as payback in kind. So retributive justice asks three general questions, philosophically understood. And this is drawn from the peace studies scholar Howard Zehr. It asks what laws have been broken, who did it, and what do they deserve? Restorative justice asks a different set of questions. It's often characterized as victim-centered justice. It asks who has been harmed, what are their needs, whose obligations and responsibilities are these, who has a stake in this situation, seeking to expand the conception of stakeholders and participants in situations of wrongdoing and harm, and then what are the processes that can involve the stakeholders in finding a solution. Now, restorative justice has been studied in recent decades, and it's been determined to be actually remarkably successful as a response to wrongdoing and harm in certain capacities. It has consistently reduced across cases what's called future delinquency, or technically referred to as recidivism, in contrast to traditional approaches. So the United States doesn't just imprison more of our citizens than any other country of the world. We also have astronomically high rates of repeat offending for people who have entered the system and then served their time. It's also the case, as it's been studied, that offenders reported increased perceptions of fairness and increasingly negative views towards delinquency, and victims reported improved perceptions of fairness, greater satisfaction, improved attitudes towards the offender, and more willingness to forgive the offender, and are more likely to feel that the outcome was just. Restorative justice is also practiced proactively, not just reactively and responsibly when harm and wrongdoing has occurred, but proactively to cultivate relationships and to build community in order to preemptively disrupt the causes and conditions of conflict, violence, and wrongdoing. And for this, it's also been studied in ways which show it to be very effective. But the question remains, can restorative justice address the structural causes and conditions of injustice and violence? In many ways, because of its success at reducing recidivism, there's a sense in which restorative justice programs have become, in effect, all the rage for people within the system. The question is, does this make it a kind of moral window dressing for a system that is at its core really functions in a way to reproduce and even expand itself? Do restorative justice programs in effect provide a kind of plausible deniability that the system in fact does that? What are the prospects for actually fundamentally changing and transforming in order to create a new way? So the question at the heart of the book then is that focused specifically on systemic racism in the United States, and in particular systemic racism as it infects mass incarceration, particularly through policing and the war on drugs. In other words, it asks, can restorative justice transformatively address the new Jim Crow, taking its cue from the kind of the conversation-changing text of 2010 put out by the legal scholar Michelle Alexander, entitled The New Jim Crow? The answer, spoiler alert, in short is that I come to is yes, but the question is how. It's not an uncontroversial answer. And I spend a number of chapters in the book trying to make the case methodically and carefully and drawing on extensive ethnographic research that I did across Chicago, it was here in response to this question that I realized myself that the answer cannot just be prosecuted at the philosophical and ethical level, but that I was going to have to get out of my office and get out of the library and into local communities where restorative justice is actually practiced. And to do so, I sought out relationship with restorative justice practitioners and communities across the city of Chicago, one of which, the most pivotal of which, is the Precious Blood Ministry of Reconciliation. So how is it able to affect such transformation? How is it conceived and how is it distinctively practiced to do so? So this is the question that one of the questions that we'll entertain. So with that, orientation enough. Now, Professor Purifoy, this time it's for real.
Okay, thank you, thank you. Very much, Dr. Spriggs. All right. So, all right, so bear with me because this is like my first time of doing a book response like this, right? So first of all, thank you for this important work that you've done and for your critical perspective on it and for inviting me to be a part of it. When you asked me, I was like, all right, that's what you're doing, Jason. There we go, go with it, forever. So, in your book, and as I told you, so if you all get it, I want to strongly recommend this book. I'm honestly going to strongly. I'm an urban sociologist, as he noted, and I study spaces, and in Chicago is one of my primary areas, and I was liking it from like page one, and I'm not easy to impress. So I'm gonna be honest with you, I'm not easy to. I'm like, that was good, Jason. I was like, okay, you're doing your thing in this book, and you clearly lay out some important things that I want to start. You really lay out in the very beginning how U.S. freedom and the pursuit of happiness is restricted, and is either restricted or it's unfettered, based on race and on class, but also that it's place-based and it's also spatial. And so for those of you who don't know, I'm a place and space specialist. So that is my perspective through which I see most things as well. So I really appreciate that you call attention and interrogate the culture of retribution in the United States in many instances, because it often doesn't distinguish between adults and children. Like we have laws that say children should be protected at all costs, but as you show in your book, they're also targeted for punishment. And it reminded me of Victor Rios's book, Punished, where he looks like in Oakland, where Black and brown youth are targeted for punishment by the police. You posited in the book that we can take a holistic approach, right, to restorative justice, and that you also can have this theory of justice, but also a form of concrete justice practices. And I think that the latter is really clear. And as I'm learning more about restorative, I know something. I taught criminal justice for a while and could do that. But one message that really became clear in your text is that question of what does it mean to actually be cared for as a member of the community, where you really weave in Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, Precious Blood Ministries, but also these ideologies of restorative justice and transformative justice in the text. And also, you talk about you want to talk about like live religion or spirituality and which one do you do? And it reminded me of a scripture. And those who know me, I do like to go to the Word of God and use it in it. It reminded me of Galatians 6, and which reads, and it's coming from the King James Version, brethren, if a man be overtaken with the fault, ye which are spiritual, restore such an one in the spirit of meekness, considering thyself, lest thou be tempted. Bear ye one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. And that scripture is something that it would be nice if the United States of America, if it's going to call itself a Christian nation, would actually apply it, right? Out at it. And what Precious Blood Ministry does in these projects and the hub is really try to apply this. Like, what does it mean to care for people as people? right? That if someone is overtaken with a fault, do you beat them down or do you try to build them back up, right? And so as I was reading the text, some major themes jumped out at me. So I'm going to go with that approach. One was social bonds. I am a Durkheimian, sociologist, so I want to talk a little bit about Durkheim, which, you hit that in the text, but also place and the power of place, race, of course, right, with it, but also institutional betrayal, institutional violence. And when I think about institutions, I'm thinking like the structural violence and the cultural violence that you talk about. And then carceral citizenship, drawing off of Reuben Miller and Forrest Stewart's work. I want to focus today in my response on social bonds, place and power, and race. All right. And I'm going to read my notes, people, so don't judge me. Okay. So, I want to begin with your interview in the back of the yards area with Jonathan Little. And he noted why he started selling drugs. Because people don't just get up in the morning and say, I want to be a drug dealer. That's what I want to do, right? I'm just going to wake up one day and just decide to do crime. It's usually something that is pushing people because they have what Robert Merton calls limited access to legitimate means of acquisition, right? Restricted access. And he talked about how he, began selling because he had siblings to take care of, right? With it. But then I thought, as I read on in the book and read in chapter 4 about the ecology of violence, I think that these two areas go together. But what popped into my mind was how often food and nutrition is connected to carceral experiences. And it's not talked about enough, right? So if someone, I remember that I used to show my students a thing on prison towns, which you dealt with a little bit in the text on this man. He was in prison, got out of prison, and then he went back to prison for stealing a can of tuna and a loaf of bread, less than $5. So we'd rather spend $50,000 to $80,000 a year to incarcerate somebody for $5. Now, these days, you might steal a carton of eggs, and that's going to be $17, right? Worth the thing. But to think about how much money we will spend to do the retribution instead of asking the question, how did we get there, right? So I thought about how food deficits are usually in those same, you talked about redlining, that when people talk about food deserts, I don't use the term food deserts, but I use the term food deprivation zones, because a desert is a naturally occurring thing, but a deprivation zone is an active thing that is happening. That, as you mentioned in the text, how white flight happened. Why do businesses move out? Why do groceries? Like, do Black and brown people ain't got to eat? Do they not have to buy things? But yet the grocery stores move out. And also this happens in rural spaces as well, where large business won't even come, right? Because their trucks can't turn around over to, as though rural folks ain't got to eat either, right? But the connection between behavior and food and nutrition also is, I see it as centered in the spaces, because in these areas that had been redlined, they also have less resources. And so the punishment is instituting various ways to really exclude people at the same time while they're locked up. But then when they get out, and you talk about this later in the book, about the stretch of the arm of the state beyond the prison walls. And they get excluded from voting, bless you, housing, employment, and licensing. So, but here and in other places, we can see that connection between food and nutrition, between the carceral state, how you end up entangled in the carceral state, and what your food nutrition trajectory is. And not only just food insecurity, but it also, food insecurity can shape decisions to commit a crime, right? And y'all seen the commercials from Snickers, right? When you hangry, you're not yourself. And so imagine if that's every day, right? That you're not knowing that food insecurity, you're not knowing where your next meal is going to come from. And so for many young folks, the last time they eat is on a Friday, and they won't necessarily eat again until they come back to school on Monday. And some parents don't eat at all because they're trying to feed their children. Now imagine that's your life. And in those same spaces, what you also see is that there's an impact on health, wellness, and the ability to focus. In those same areas, we see a lot of liquor stores and a lot of stores that also sell high sodium, high processed foods. Now we know that sodium is an agitator. So lots of sodium, alcohol don't tend to go well together, right? Why are we not solving the bodily problem in order to impact what is happening in behaviors. And I think that you bring that out, even though you don't get all into food and nutrition, but the lack of focus, the feelings of despair, right? Like how many times can you focus and make good decisions when you're really hungry? But it also brings about multiple health issues. And when we couple that with spaces that are also hyper surveilled, over policed, and targeted for punition, can we expect that the results are going to be different? So here's a couple questions for you. Okay. People talk about broken windows, and you mentioned it in your book. But what about food deprivation and the message it in a landscape filled with alcohol and high sodium buildings that usually also have bars on it at the same time? So think about what message it sends into a community that the places where you can get any resources tend to also have bars. It sends a message that I think you're a criminal. Bring me your coins and buy from the store, but I still think you're a criminal. So I'm going to bar up my windows, bar up the door. This is what you're walking through on your way to school, when you're going to the bus stop, when you're going shopping, or when you're doing the one-stop convenience shop where you get your phone, your chicken, and other things taken care of, right? So when we talk about, but what about the food and deprivation and the message that it sends to the landscape as well? Then my second question within this same category is, how did you witness the role, or did you witness the role of food and nutrition in the work at Precious Blood and in the back of the yards area? Okay, so that's one question. My second theme that I want to talk about is the power of place. On pages 59 and 57 and 59, you really show the power of redlining. And that extends beyond the mapping that set folks and spaces on trajectories of having their citizenship extracted from them because they were targeted for it, right? So no equal protection under the law, right? No right to pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and so forth. And what we know from various types of research is that redlining has an enduring effect on the south and west sides of Chicago, and in most communities, Baltimore, wherever you go, where it was the case, right? Where whites who fled continued to avoid spaces and even the imaginaries about these particular areas. So I thought about Dolores Hayden's work on the power of place, which says that histories don't become of non-effect just because people move from it. And the back of the yards in particular has been a space of slaughter for well over a century. It housed animals and immigrants, but it was never really a desirable place where people are like, oh, I want to go live by the cows, right? And smell that all day long, right? But it went from one way of living to another, which you talk about a little bit in the book. But it has not spatially or materially transformed into a landscape of peace, even though it has pockets of peace in it. So and I think that's important. So then my question for you on that is, how during those 5 years that you were doing the project, have you witnessed a need to transform the materiality and the physicality of the space along with the restorative justice to create a more peaceful landscape, if at all? So I'm going to quote you, Father Dave, right here, where you say, this is a place that seeks to create that physical space where people are accused and people who are the harmed can perhaps participate in each other's healing. So like places like, and how that happens and how can we materially and spatially and physically change it? And then the last theme, the last two, I'm checking my time, I think I'm okay, right? Is race. And I really appreciate that you point out not only the role of redlining, but the role of highways and how they were, we bulldozed through South Side neighborhoods and West Side neighborhoods who are still experiencing not only the consequences of having their neighborhoods, but also the environmental hazards that come along with it. Near back of the yards is Little Village, which has intense environmental racism, but it's a very congested space, one of the most congested in the country, and it has an impact on people's health. So let's add then food and nutrition problems along with environmental racism in the area. And so this can't really be extracted, right, from us understanding the incarceration patterns, because the same communities and the same people are targeted then and still being targeted now. That whole idea of being hazards, right? Because it wasn't just about redlining communities or, but the names that were ascribed to. The state sponsored this. And then you begin to talk about the new Jim Crow, which you mentioned in your beginning, and these race-coded carceral and correction system that is also place-based, right? Where there's an abundance of Blackness and abundance of brownness, right? Makes it easier to really target people for punishment. What do I mean by that is if I keep people, Patrick Sharkey talks about stuck in place. If I keep people stuck in place, then I can get you. I ain't got to go roaming looking for you. Right? I just target the communities for it. And in that same chapter, you talk about, like, we argue that the carceral system is really another form of racial terror, which is the word, the phrase that you use, that moves beyond the spectacle. So here I'm drawing on Foucault, right? And so Foucault in the in Crime and Punishment, in Discipline and Punishment, he talks about, like, back prior to modern prisons, we would bring people who had committed some offense, put them in the town square and punish them. And we know in the United States, we did that, like, with lynchings, right? That we not only brought the public in to watch people being lynched, but we also made postcards, sent them out across the country, and things like that. We celebrated this spectacle. And so what you show in the book is, like, how this spectacle continues to target the body and the mind, which Foucault talks about, but also the soul. And so I think you can make that spiritual argument in your book, but also the spaces where respite is supposed to occur, which is the home. If you can't be safe in the community in which you live, it's different like when you're out in the public square. But if you can't be safe in your community, where's your respite supposed to come? And it really reminds me of a couple of pieces that I'll bring to your attention. Khalid Muhammad's The Condemnation of Blackness, where he examines how crime was written through the Black body in the US, but also Rashad Shabaz's work on spatializing Blackness, where he talks about the architects of confinement and Black masculinity in Chicago. So my question for you in this theme of race is, how then can we say that restorative justice can be a form of restoration for the state too? By the state being involved in it, it can also have some sort of restoration. And I mean, even though at the same time, as you point out in your book, it continues to target Black and brown youth. And then the last, and one I think the most important themes in your book, is that of social bonds, right? This is where I really see one of your greatest contributions in the book. And when you talk about radical hospitality, I love that term, right? And walking alongside helps to reduce the violence of inequality to some extent. With it, that inequality really fractures, and you get at this in the book in a very real way, that inequality fractures social bonds. So if inequality is fracturing social bonds, and then we have these challenges as a city, as a community, as a state, and as a nation, how can we come together to rise up if we are fracturing bonds all along the way, right? And so you also, in chapter 5, you talk about these fractured bonds, but bringing in this collective consciousness back. And that's why I thought about Durkheim, right? With mechanical solidarity, where collective consciousness was the way of life. And then we moved to organic solidarity, where laws and division of labor happen. But what I see is that restorative justice and transformative justice, I think, can bridge those two areas, right? That we can see the seeds, the ethos of mechanical solidarity through what restorative justice does and what transformative justice does. I think it really blends it in a way that's really important for cities and communities and the US. I also enjoyed that you talked about the holistic response, and that's part of the social bonds, this mutual recognition and support that does require a lot of trust with it as well, but also envision from the victim who received the criminal act, but also the victim and offender. And what I mean by that is the offender who was victimized by the system, right? And is carrying out that victimization through criminal behavior, behavior that's been labeled as criminal with it as well. But you talk about, like, how community members together can confront counteract, these are your words, heal and work to transform the causes and conditions of multiple forms of violence. And then in chapter 13, you talked about this restorative policing and this and the circles and whose voice and how y'all work that out, right? I thought that was like super interesting. And a lot of people in criminal justice do talk about like community policing and how do we do that, but we never asked the question, like, how did we get to where police were not seen as peace givers for the people who they're supposed to protect and serve? And how can restorative justice and transformative justice shift, because we know policing has a long racist history in the United States, and because we never address that, it stalks the present day, right? We see the residue of slave codes and things that police did as policing grew. So my question, because you suggest that restorative justice, and I'm wrapping it up, people, and transformative justice can really alter those trajectories, right, of people, specifically the latter, by bringing into or building organic solidarity with a mechanical solidarity, like that true community. So how do you see transformative justice creating the option? You mentioned that restorative justice is proactive, even though on the surface, many may say, as you pointed out, that restorative justice is actually reactive. When it can actually have the ability to be proactive through its response cases, like how, so if restorative justice is to work, is, y'all ever watched this show, Person of Interest? Okay, so the whole premise of person of interest is being able to predict where a crime is going to occur and stop it before it happens, right? So if restorative justice and transformative justice can do that, do you see where it can always be preventative, right? Not just proactive, but actually preventative, because if I can restore a person to a community, will that reduce the chances of them recidivating with it as well? Okay, that's it for me, good people. Thank you. Yes, I'm sorry.
Well, thank you, thank you, thank you. That was fantastic. Great overview, fabulous questions. I'll put my oar in the water here. So hello, it's an honor really to be on the panel, to be with you all, and to have had a chance to read this fabulous book. I've had the chance to work with Dr. Springs for many years here, through my work at the Institute for Social Concerns, doing community engaged research work for justice. Dr. Springs and I share a deep respect and love for Susan Sharp, my now retired social concern, yes, right, shout out, right? Retired colleague who really animated restorative justice discussion and practice on campus as well as in the local community here. Dr. Springs has been a generous partner with our faculty, undergraduates, and graduate students, always practicing the kind of honest, intentional presence with us that I see him outline so beautifully in the new book. So what a gift to read Restorative Justice and Lived Religion, Transforming Mass Incarceration in Chicago. I received my PhD from Loyola Chicago, so Rogers Park up north there. All right, so I have an affinity for the work and for the place as well. So I will admit that I approach this book the way I approach student papers. I flip to the back first. I like to review an author's sources and notes before I jump into the introduction to the beginning. By starting at the end, I get a sense of the author's key influences and themes. Who are they citing? Who aren't they citing? Who and what gets the most hits in the index? As someone who studies poverty, I always look for words like poverty and poor, and I pop into those sections first to get a sense of how the author is framing and handling the issue. In case you don't do that, I will share that neither the word poverty nor poor are indexed. However, if you read the book, you understand that poverty is not mentioned in any one place. It is mentioned every place in this book. It's on pages 1 through 212. So poverty is always already present in communities like back of the yards that have exceptionally high incarceration rates. Poverty is both a cause and a consequence of incarceration. As Equal Justice Initiative founder Brian Stevenson says, in too many places, the opposite of poverty is not wealth. The opposite of poverty is justice. So in a world of plenty, the presence of poverty signals the presence of injustice. While this is a thoroughly academic book, theorizing and arguing for ways restorative justice enacts justice, it's also a book about the people who teach us how to do that work. Through his description of the precious blood ministry of reconciliation work in Back of the Yards, Dr. Springs invites readers to visit a place with high poverty and low justice, populated by people with immeasurable vision and love. And he helps us see how that transformation happens through critical participatory action research and deep empathetic listening. I noted two rhetorical choices Dr. Springs makes that create a remarkably engaging study. First, he asks questions, a whole lot of questions. And second, he engages critiques of restorative justice directly. These choices reflect the spirit of restorative practice in that they suggest a dialectical and deep listening approach. The first chapter title and about half the chapter titles that follow include questions, as do many of the subheadings. The approach suggests the honest seeking in his research. Likewise, Dr. Springs includes the voice of critics of restorative justice from beginning to end. The power and place of restorative justice, he establishes, is a living question, and this is a critical moment for determining how it can play a role in transforming mass incarceration, not just in Chicago, but across the United States. He outlines several critical debates related to restorative justice and mass incarceration, interpersonal versus systemic transformation, religious versus spiritual frameworks, and prison abolition versus prison reform, to name a few. He gives all positions ample attention and care. And while he does ask many questions, he also delivers well-informed answers, showing that restorative justice has often been misrepresented. His clarification is patient but firm. I have known about restorative justice work at least since 2012, when I was trained to become a circle process facilitator informed by restorative justice practices. But I didn't know how much I needed this book to refocus my work until I read it. I bet others need it now too. Dr. Springs connects the history and current arguments around restorative justice, restorative transformative justice in ways that have the power to align and sharpen all our efforts to address the injustice of mass incarceration. So I want to pause now to admit that it took me a long time to read this book. It took a long time because my mind kept wandering off to apply and compare the theories and practices outlined in the book to justice work I'm more closely connected to, which I will share here. In 2012, I visited Susan Sharp and Writing and Rhetoric faculty Ed Kelly's Inside Out course at Westville Correctional Facility. It's a 3,400 bed Indiana State men's prison about 50 minutes west of here. I left the prison that day shook by the flash of learning and relationships I had witnessed. And I said, someday I'm going to teach out there. 12 years later, I did. I taught Poverty and Justice Inside Out in spring semester 2024. Inside Out, for those who don't know, is a national and now international program that teaches professors how to take outside college students into prison to learn side by side with inside incarcerated students. So I taught a 3-credit course on poverty and justice with students doing exactly the same work in exactly the same place, inside Westville Correctional Facility. I'm teaching that course again this semester, all day, every Friday. I just keep thinking about how that kind of experience fits into the ecosystem of restorative justice described in the book. So the first image that flashed before me as I was reading was a day last year when one of the younger incarcerated students came into class with his blaze orange synthetic knit hat pulled way down on one side. But he could not pull that hat down far enough to hide a huge black eye. He was late and he sat quickly between 2 Notre Dame students. The students, by the way, just as an aside, the students sit in a circle, kind of every other inside-outside student so they can get to know each other, but they cannot touch in any way or exchange anything. If you drop a pencil, you pick it up. All exchange of materials has to go through me, so there's a kind of spoke system with me at the center. The inefficiencies in the system are incredibly irritating and enlightening. I have these tiny moments throughout the day where I get to look at each student and hand them something, receive something, and exchange a few words, and I savor those opportunities to connect. So this student was agitated, and I was trying to decide how I should address him as I handed him his materials for the day. I never ask how an inside student's week was. I assume it wasn't great. I try to focus on the present. So that day I said what I always said. It's good to see you. I'm glad you're here. He paused to see if I was going to ask the obvious question or demand a story. I did not. He then said, "Shit happens." I said, "Yep, shit happens." And I moved along, and he calmed down and participated fully in class. His cap gradually moved up to the normal position. So this image came to me when I read Dr. Spring's description of our current justice system as retributive, a system that, quote, isolates and incapacitates, quote, an eye for an eye. In this case, an eye was the literal payment for some transaction in the underground economy of the prison, which functions a lot like the above ground economy that extracts and exploits from consumers and citizens until we're broken. Oppression replicates oppression. Dr. Springs references Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, which is one of the books we read in class. Sinclair writes, "There's one kind of prison where the man is behind bars and everything that he desires is outside. And there's another kind where the things are behind bars and the man is outside. For some people, being inside or being outside isn't that different." And to complete this class picture, I have to share that another young inside student in that class had lost an eye entirely. His wound was older and had healed, physically anyway. I can't help but think that these men bore the physical scars of the psychological wounds we inflict through our current justice system, which is blind to the pain it causes. I don't know if Inside Out courses would be considered pure models of restorative justice, but they're certainly informed by such work. While Inside Out trains us to teach in circles and build community, it also mandates that we not contact the inside students in any way after our class. Dr. Spring says, quote, "The criminal justice system operates by severing relationships. This is one of its structural features," end quote. So this Inside Out rule, which is in place for some valid reasons, seems nonetheless to run counter to that goal of building and maintaining relationships. But still, somehow, I do think the course works toward that restorative justice goal of humanizing participants, all of them. This is on the individual level, though. I don't know if it achieves that systemic transformation, but I think it's in the right orbit. You can tell me. This semester, the students in my class include 8 Notre Dame undergraduates, 4 Notre Dame law students, at least 2 of whom want to be prosecutors, 10 incarcerated men, minus 2 who were removed for unstated reasons, and 4 correction staff. This is the first time correction staff have been included in a Westville Inside Out course, and it is rare among Inside Out courses anywhere. I contacted the founder of Inside Out to get her thoughts on including the correction staff, and she issued many cautions. But I took this on at the request of the deputy warden of Westville and the director of prison education for the Indiana Department of Corrections. He partners with my colleague Mike Hebler, who directs all the Notre Dame prison education programs. We have a long and strong relationship with these entities, and to keep the full slate of prison education programs in good standing, we entertained this request. Honestly, I was willing right away. It had become clear to me that the corrections staff often come from similar backgrounds as the incarcerated men. Not that you can generalize about anyone there. One of my incarcerated students this semester has a bachelor's and a master's degree, much more education than any of the corrections staff in class. The deputy warden reached out to 6 corrections staff, all on the social services side, not officers, who he thought would be strong students in this trial run. I was only willing to take 4 of the 6 he selected so that they wouldn't be too much of a presence in the class. He said that was fine. The others could do it next time. He was already invested in the next time. So far, it's going as expected, a little bumpy. On the first day, one of the incarcerated students said something about the correction staff getting paid to be there, to which they quickly corrected the student that they were off the clock and they were completely there by choice, or more accurately, incentivized in part by the promise of those 3 credits, just like every other student in the class. Later, one of the correction staff got into a back and forth with one of the incarcerated students. We moved on, but on the way home, the outside student said that they were uncomfortable with that exchange, and I thought all week about what I could do to address it. At the start of the next class, when we were all just getting settled, that corrections staff person went up to that student completely unprompted and apologized for her behavior the previous week. Is that a spark of transformation, of systemic transformation? Are the core elements of holistic restorative justice, as Dr. Springs outlines them, present here? Encounter, accountability, and transformation? Or is this initiative an example of restorative justice being co-opted or captured by the state? I don't know. I would love to hear what the panel thinks. I do know that this experience made us throw out our reductive dichotomous labels. There is no inside and outside student anymore. There never was. There's just what we hold inside ourselves and what we choose to put outside into that circle. Like Dr. Springs, I find myself asking a lot of questions as I think about this work. Is it cruel to talk about poverty and justice literally inside the heart of mass incarceration? Should I be teaching joy studies instead? While we do engage artwork often, looking at paintings, poetry, photography, and more in ways that feel playful and joyous, I've come to think that this is exactly the place for this kind of academic discussion. It's a form of critical praxis, as Dr. Spring says, quote, that facilitates people's recognition of the sources, nature, and character of the injustices they experience in their lives and in their communities, end quote. In some ways, an honest education is cruel. It's hard to confront the atrocities of our ancestors and our contemporaries. But honesty is a core principle of restorative justice, and our schools are expunging that history from the curriculum as we speak. We cannot suppress or erase those harms. They come back to us one way or the other, often as ghosts of unresolved despair. As we read Matthew Desmond's Poverty by America, incarcerated students said things like, I always felt like things were stacked against me, that I couldn't get ahead. Desmond confirms that it's not just me. There's a whole system out to get me. Desmond has citations. He has science, they say. Shit happens by design. That evidence can be both heartbreaking and liberating. There are street smarts and there are Wall Street smarts. This class's defensive training against powerful predatory financial and social systems that rely on ignorance and submission. Dr. Springs quotes Father David Kelly, quoting Father Greg Boyle of Homeboy Industries, as saying, nothing stops a bullet like a job. But maybe books are bulletproof too. Books read in accompaniment in radically inclusive classrooms. I will admit that as I read Restorative Justice and Lived Religion, my mind also wandered to two popular kinds of heroic justice transformation stories from my youth. The first was the DC Comics Hall of Justice that held superheroes, the kind that started out mild-mannered and quite ordinary until they went into a phone booth to change or spun into Amazonian perfection. And in a flash of dramatic transformation, these heroes had the power to impose justice on anyone who violated their rules. They were the indomitable League of Justice, right? As I read Restorative Justice and Lived Religion, I wondered if there's a restorative justice flash that signals successful transformation, right? Is it instantaneous, something spin and pop out, right? That we know it's happened. But then I thought of the other, even more popular transformative justice story from my youth, the story of Jesus. In this story, we start with an all-powerful hero, and that hero does the most unexpected, extraordinary thing. He divests his power. He becomes human. Fully human. Jesus ate, he drank, he made friends, he made enemies. He taught, he learned, he lived, and he bled. So what does restorative justice, transformative justice look like? I taught at Westville on Friday, Valentine's Day. Holidays are difficult to celebrate in prison. I can still hear the echo of the class singing happy birthday to an incarcerated student last year, spontaneously bursting into song when he shared the news. That song sounds different in prison. I still wanted to acknowledge the holiday Friday, so I opened the class by talking about a different kind of love, agape love. I asked if the students knew what it was, and the collective wisdom was impressive. They said, it's love that's unconditional, empathetic, abundant, action-oriented, and selfless. We had finished reading Poverty by America for that class, and Desmond concludes by having us imagine a world without poverty, He encourages us to take very doable action steps to make sure all Americans have their basic needs met throughout their lives so that they do not feel the kind of isolation and disconnection that leads to acts of despair. He has us imagine a place where that better world is enacted through what Dr. Springs might call critical praxis. So I handed out blank paper to the students and had them draw agape love. Some drew pictures of an abundant and flourishing natural world with clean air and water. One student drew a basketball court where his struggling family would gather in their own cheering section to support him. Another drew hands reaching to connect. Then I had the class read pages 36 to 37 of Dr. Springs' Restorative Justice and Lived Religion aloud. This is the passage that describes how precious blood reclaimed the dismantled and denuded space where St. John of God Church had stood. What the formal church had vacated, the everyday church re-inhabited, transforming, quote, the vacant crater that the diocese left into a peace garden, a welcoming space, mowed, blooming, and usable, replete with grills, basketball courts, and beehives. The students read this passage aloud, summoning this sacred space, breathing agape love into the room. And for just a second, I felt that transformative flash. I felt that maybe this book has the power to stop bullets. So thank you for publishing this book right now. We need it, and I look forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to come. I come at this a little bit differently. This is more personal to me. All my adult life, I've been working in jails and detention centers, almost exclusively in Chicago. And since I've been in my early 20s, living on the south side of Chicago. And in jails and detention centers, and early on, working at a parish, it was a parish-based jail ministry. Thank you. I get a lot of help. Parish-based jail ministry. Larry Craig, who was an archdiocesan priest of Chicago, believed that because he was committed to those incarcerated and their families, believed that something that people needed most who were incarcerated and coming home was a sense of community, a sense of being connected. And so we placed the jail ministry within the community, a community that was welcoming, a community that was engaging them and then accompanied folks who are coming home with the resources they needed. And in that space, in that parish-based jail ministry where I served for 20-some years, it also was on a gang boundary, and so I did a lot of funerals of young people. And a lot of people, accompanied a lot of people who are harmed. And when you live in a community and going into the jails and living in that community, oftentimes you know both the persons who committed the harm and also the persons who were harmed. And as anybody that's been to court knows, that the criminal justice system is not so much about justice, but rather about the adversarial system that is set up to one person in their minds loses, the other person wins. And anybody that's had that experience knows that usually both lose. No one wins. And because some of those were very personal, where I knew both sides, and the attention was on punishment and not on caring for the person who was harmed, we began in 2002 Precious Blood Ministry of Reconciliation. And I'm a priest. My congregation is Missionary of the Precious Blood, otherwise, therefore Precious Blood Ministry. And the spirituality that I embrace is that of the Paschal Mystery, the suffering, death, and resurrection of Christ. That in the midst of suffering and pain, in the midst of that travesty, there is that possibility of hope, of a new beginning, a new creation, if you will. And that's what brought me into restorative justice. We are seeking something that will allow us to live out that spirituality. We're seeking to build and create a space where people who are impacted by violence and incarceration, people who are both harmed and people who did harm, could come together somehow and participate in some fashion in one another's healing. And I knew a little bit about restorative justice, but I stumbled upon Kay Pranis's book, Peacemaking Circle from Crime to Community. And as I engaged that book and started to read that book, I said, this is so Catholic. It's all about symbols. It's all about stories. It's all about rituals. It's all about creating safe spaces where people can come together and really get to know one another and come to realize that you are not that other that others have been depicting you. So restorative justice is really not a program. It's a philosophy. It's a way of seeing. You know, in our world today, we do a lot of othering. You know, you're that color, that culture, that ethnicity. Rather than restorative justice, it's a philosophy that engages us as one. It's that Ubuntu understanding that if you're not good, then I'm not good. If you're not whole, then I'm not whole. And so as we engaged restorative justice, it was a practical way to live out our spirituality. And with a language that a priest coming from Precious Blood Ministry of Reconciliation could use to engage others who are not from a religious background. Most of my work is with people who are not churched or unchurched or do not come from a church facility. So restorative justice allows me to live out that spirituality in a way that I can engage them and use a terminology that embraces the philosophy, the spirituality that I hold dear and what I think is important. The other thing I really liked about, so Jason came to PBMR, Precious Blood, and I must admit, you know, here we have an academia person come from Notre Dame to do research on us. And I come with a lot of hesitation. And he's persistent, if nothing else. He kept coming. I'm not sure we invited him, but he did come. And the way he did it was to engage us, to sit in these spaces, not to ask questions, but rather to listen and to kind of get into the culture of Precious Blood Ministry of Reconciliation, to kind of understand some of the nuances of that work, of reconciliation, of restorative justice. And little by little, he became part of the fabric. And I think what I appreciated a lot about the book, and I'll say, you know, when you open a book and you know the author, you're thinking, okay, let me read this book. But as I read it, it really articulated so much of what I believe and what I hold dear. And so I think that's what I appreciate most. He took the stories of Precious Blood and other communities and brought it into something that in which we could communicate with one another, where you could hold on to it. It's not just a feeling, but it's articulated. And I think that's so critically important. You know, I do a lot of peacemaking circles, which is one of the practices of restorative justice. It's a community-based kind of practice where you really focus on one another and building community, building a safe enough environment, uses stories and whatnot to really bring us together. I work a lot with moms who have lost children to homicide. I told this story in one of the classes, but work a lot with moms who have lost children to homicide. And they know I go into the jail and detention center, and at first they were pretty hesitant about how I could do that, how I could listen to their stories of pain and trauma, and at the very same time then go into the detention center or go into the jail and visit those who perhaps were those who perpetrated that harm. But they kind of, as I said before, they kind of liked me, and so they put up with me. And we sat in those spaces, and they would ask about these young people, particularly juveniles. Do they ever say they're sorry? Are they ever remorseful? Do they ever admit that they did wrong? And I said, yeah, all the time. And little by little, as they asked question after question, I said, look, why don't you come in with me and sit in spaces with these young people? And that, at the beginning, that wasn't going to happen. They didn't want to do that. That was a jail. That was but I did a Catholic Mass there. And these moms knew the Mass, and that was a safe space for them. And so they came in with me, we celebrated Mass, and after Mass, we sat in a circle with young people who were being tried as adults. And the reason I chose those young people who were being tried as adults because they had been there for over a year and a half, and I knew them well, and I knew who they were. And I knew the moms would never do anything to bring harm to those young people. And so we sat in those spaces. And as in any circle, in any restorative justice practice, the first thing you do is try to get to know one another. You build relationships. It's relational. And so we opened with just an introduction of who we are. And the moms, of course, began to weep at the loss of their child, that was their identity. And the young people then spoke to their harm and their hurt. In the beginning, the moms were kind of like this and hesitant and very guarded. But as the young people talked about their mom being in prison, or their mom being on drugs, or yet one didn't even know his mom, these mothers began to lean in and began to see them differently. They no longer saw them as thieves and thugs, but they rather saw them as young people who themselves have been victimized. And as we gathered together and we told stories, and there was laughter and joy and community, albeit communion, we closed up the circle. And as anybody that's worked in jails, detention centers know, when it's time's up, time's up. And they called the young people back up to their cells, and the moms helped me gather some of the stuff up from our peacemaking circle. And they said, okay, now what? I says, what do you mean, now what? And they said, well, we just can't leave them. Well, we can't stay either. So, and they demanded that they come back to celebrate with these young people. They recognized, talking about food insecurity, that they needed to bring in some food. They needed to break bread with these young people. They needed to have, in my words, not theirs, communion. And so we came back together. They brought in food, and food enough for not only those kids, but others. And we sat there and we broke bread and continued that relationship. That's what happened when you focus on relationship versus an issue. Restorative justice is all about relational. It's what we do in our own families. This is not foreign stuff. This is about family. It's about kinship. It's about relationship. You know, in the Native American tradition, when someone does something wrong, when someone does a crime or harm, they say to them, you act as though you have no family. You act outside the bond of love that you're a part of. And I think that the restorative justice is just that. It's that whole relationship that we have with one another, that ultimately we're not all that different from one another. And in today's world where there is so much othering, I think restorative justice is so much needed. The problem with restorative justice is many problems. One, it takes time. It's a lot easier to expel a kid than to sit in a space and circle with them. It also involves investment. You know, a kid comes in, does something wrong, we say, get out. Done. Now I'm off to my next thing. Restorative justice, you need to sit and you need to be involved in their lives. And then if you've ever sat in a circle, that's not the end of it. You walk with them for whatever their needs might be. So it's hard and it takes time and it demands you give up power. And I think that's one of the reasons why we aren't seeing this in our criminal justice system. It's very hard for our criminal legal system to give up power and that domineering kind of power. Tell one last story, and I told this too, but it's very personal. I have a young man that I've known for, I don't know, 20 years almost probably. He was 13, 14 when he came to the center. I knew his older brother, I knew his family, I knew his situation. He was a participant, then he worked at Precious Blood Ministry of Reconciliation. He wasn't a real people person. He kind of worked in the back. He did our newsletter and things like that. And as he grew older and he had the children, he needed something a little bit more to be able to support his children. He has three beautiful children, beautiful wife. They're all together, young man, strong. And he went on to become I don't even know, in Chicago, there's ComEd as our power system, our power company. And he's a poleman. He goes up on the poles and fixes all that stuff. So he's got a good job, probably making $70,000 plus money and able to really sustain himself and his family. A real game changer because his mom and dad were both addicted, and he has a thing that really changed the equation. He graduated to another level on he got a white helmet, and he was celebrating and drank a little bit, and there was a gun. It wasn't his gun. Frankly, it was his wife's gun, and she had a FOID card. But he got caught, and he went to jail for the gun. And I accompanied him in court, and he was let out on electronic monitoring, those little monitorings they put on your leg to make sure you're where they want you to be. and we would go to court. And he went to this one time, and I told this story too. He went, Lamont's a good-looking young man, African-American dreads, and he went there, and he went with a white button-up shirt, black slacks, and what he called church shoes. And he went with his dreads pulled tightly back. And as I was in the gallery and he was standing in front of the judge, they called him menace to society and dangerous and all those kinds of things. I couldn't help but to think how much Lamont was trying to look as white as he could in front of this white judge, white prosecutor, white defense person. And it broke my heart that they didn't. And I wanted to scream out in that courtroom, you don't even know him, and you're passing judgment. I think the difference between restorative justice and what's so powerful about restorative justice is about you get to know one another. And then once you get to know one another, it's really hard to hate somebody. It's really hard to hate somebody you really know. And so restorative justice, I think, is so, so very important for our society and today's work. And I think that comes through in Jason's book, that you don't have to separate the sacred from the profane. You know, the indigenous folks teach us about the medicine wheel, that we're spiritual, we're emotional, we're cognitive, and we're physical people. And all that needs to bring to bear on whatever the issues we are going through as a society, as a community. And so I'm grateful, Jason, to be here, of course. I feel a little inadequate with so much academia around me. But nonetheless, I'm grateful for your book.
Well,
Oh, sorry. Maybe I'd turn it on.
all right. I'm haunted by a caution shared with me by the Kroc director, Asher Kaufman, in a brief coffee side conversation about the constitution of this panel. And when I remember saying, and Father Dave Kelly, to which he paused and said, you need to be careful. He's going to be a tough act to follow. And so it is. Thank you so much, Father Dave, for being here and for speaking time and again to our classes and to us. And I thank the other panelists as well for your thoughtful, really serious engagement with the material and thinking along with it in a way that's both critical but also constructive and most importantly expansive. Because, you know, while the book on one level tries to intervene in some debates that are properly described as philosophical and ethical and really are very much alive among activists and practitioners and academics and researchers as well, form, so on and so forth. The book also, I mean, tries to both expand upon and inflect and further that conversation. A conversation that, as I like to say, tries to put front and center practitioners and the voices of practitioners. And it's very true that I just kind of stumbled my way into Precious Blood Ministry of Reconciliation. And I cannot overstate how grateful I am for the radical hospitality that you showed me. This is one of the pillars upon which restorative justice practice is based by Precious Blood and by the network of community-based, community-led restorative justice hubs that has emerged across the city of Chicago, working collaboratively, integratively, and yet intentionally and strategically maintaining their respective autonomy in a way, but yet in a way that creates a web of restorative justice spaces and places that concentrate and shares power in a way that the system, the justice system, has to pay attention and recognize this as a game changer. But also, And this is part of the genius of it. And this is what I try to capture in the book. And I think is one of the most unique ways that what has been unfolding over the last 20 years of Chicago particularly intervenes in these sometimes obstinate conversations that we academics tend to get ourselves into. And that is, it refuses to participate in a dichotomous opposition between those who would resist the system and actors in the system, especially those who recognize that the system is broken and cannot be fixed, and seek some transformational possibilities, meaningful change, fundamental change, and because of that seek, as Father Dave has described it on numerous occasions to me, to be in deep relationship with restorative justice communities and practitioners. And so part of what I try to get out in the book, and I think all the contributions helpfully touch on in different ways, and I'm so grateful for that, is this effort to try to what we philosophers would call mediate this opposition, which is to say, recognize the countervailing positions that appear to be locked in a kind of standing negation of one another, and then find a way to think through this that can tap into and carry forward their respective strengths while leaving the weaknesses behind into a kind of further possibility. It's not a synthesis necessarily, but a further possibility. And so to hear the book redescribed in the terms that you offered to me is really, really wonderful and eye-opening. I'll just very, very quickly in passing, I know that we want to take what's been said here, what you've written out, and turn it into a collection to which I would formally respond. So just a handful of responses quickly. First, Gwendolyn, thank you so much for the series of questions. And the move from broken windows to food landscape is really quite brilliant, I think. It's not one that I saw at the time until you named it. But because, you know, part of the argument that I try to construct is that insofar as what will it take restorative justice to become transformational rather than just a very powerful form of healing relationships, which is fundamental and it must retain, but to be transformational. There are those who say it can't be precisely because of that. And one of the steps in that is to expose using the peace studies terms of structural violence and cultural violence that are the causes and conditions of what comes to be described as criminality, criminal behavior, processes of criminalization, and the deep histories that are there, the forms of generational poverty, practices like redlining, policing strategies like broken windows that take incarceration out of prisons and expand it across communities and write it upon places and spaces, as you say, and bodies as well. So the turn to Foucault, I think, is actually really helpful. I tried to keep in the book the heavier theory to the footnotes intentionally. There's a footnote in there in which I say, look, I want to speak to scholars and engage these debates, but I really try, most importantly, want to kind of make what I encountered here available to other practitioners and possibilities for implementation. There, I think what's interesting with regard to what came to my mind when you talked about like the Foucaultian echoes. Here, I think that's right. And the ways that forms of domination write themselves across our bodies and our souls in virtue of inhabiting these spaces and places and the histories that they bring. And that has to be a vector of illumination if restorative justice is going to work. But still, Connie's question of, is it transformational? Is this transformational? Is this small thing transformational? Is transformation here? Because when we say transformation, we think big. And people often push back. Where's maybe I see that this is a dynamic or a component or an impetus, but where's the transformation? And so here I want to move from, like the good, theoretician I was trained to be, from Foucault and maybe Pierre Bourdieu to a lesser known French theorist, but Michel Desserteaux, who's a Jesuit, who wrote a book in response to Foucault and Bourdieu's accounts of the way domination inhabits space and body to, as he put it, the title of the book was The Practice of Everyday Life. And the ways that the small ways we live our lives, walking in the city was a chapter, and reading as poaching, practices of intentional reading, and at the minuscule can become thoughtful, intentional, meditative modes of resistance. And I think that there's a sense in which that kind of is the secret to the way that restorative justice practices can be resistant. And in a way, and Connie, you kept using the term, which I was very thankful for, become critical praxis, right? Which is this integration of without resorting to highfalutin theory, can be a form of self-reflexivity that is critical, that works together in these circles in many cases to say, hey, what is the nature and character of the force that we find ourselves up against? What is the experience that you've had, and how do I share that experience? Which brings it to a level of explicitation in everyday language, in the terms of everyday experience through which it can be shared, and on that basis, perhaps understood differently, collectively, and through that then resisted in innovative ways. And I think that that's what opens up an avenue for transformation. And that I do see in your description of Inside Out, Connie, as you describe it there. I think very much it has the transformational, the critical praxis component to it that I think is so, that I describe. At the same time, at the risk of being lost in theory, I would like to say this, and this kind of haunted me, an image that haunted me, because as I stumbled my way into Precious Blood and was so warmly welcomed and received, and people there were like, all right, we don't understand much of what you say to us, but we're happy to talk with you and let you interview us and things like this. And Father Dave, he is, as the young person that I interviewed, he's probably the toughest old white dude that I ever met as well. And he was not hesitant to correct me when I had the inclination to take what I thought I understood and run with it. And that turned out, and on numerous occasions, which turned out to be so very helpful and vital to taking the people and the places, the stories, the forms and practices of resistance brought together for purposes of a kind of collective change and transformation, intentionally so. And put those on display, make those the centerpieces of the book. Right, and let those in to some degree, in as much as you can, kind of speak for themselves. I mean, my work as the author is not just to curate these, but to try to read them and perhaps explicate them in a way that gets to the what I consider to be the form and approach to restorative justice that is necessary for it to have this transformational impact. So the attention to structural and cultural violence, practicing it in ways that are informal and everyday lived forms of critical praxis that then facilitate forms of creativity, innovation, collective community resistance. And this is what I saw at Precious Blood Ministry of Reconciliation and in the Hub Network. And so the image I was haunted by, as I mentioned ago, is I think it's by Matthias Glockenwald, is it? That there's a portrait of, I think, Emmanuel, maybe you can help me. I think it's called The Crucifixion or The Passion of the Christ. I think it's The Crucifixion. What is it? Grunewald. Thank you. And this was a picture, and I'm not trained as a theologian, but kind of there was some training back there long ago. And I will never claim it because theologians would make short work of me. But I'm reminded that this is a portrait in a small form that the great Reformed theologian Karl Barth had on the wall of his study. He was inspired by it. And Karl Barth was one of the greatest theologians. I think maybe it was Pius XII, Pope Pius XII called him the greatest theologian since Thomas Aquinas. And that's a high praise for a Protestant, okay, from a pope. And he wrote this 10 to 12,000 page work called The Church Dogmatic. And someone said, well, how do you make sense of this massive work that you have? And he said, I compare it to this picture of the crucifixion in which Christ is on the cross and John the Baptist stands next to him, and John the Baptist is kind of posed and has his index finger pointing out to the crucifixion. He says, I consider the church dogmatics the pointer finger pointing to there. And so I don't want to compare myself to Karl Barth. Some might. I'm like, come on, folks. I think I heard somebody make that comparison before, but of course I jest, but the impetus of the book was in a certain way through this process of discovery and research and the kind of the methodology that I came to understand in terms of critical participatory action research. The book, I hoped by the time I was finishing and revising the final versions of the manuscript, was to be a pointer finger to the kind of work that was being done at Precious Blood Ministry of Reconciliation, which I do think really gets it in this holistic, multidimensional, critically reflexive, intentionally resistant, and yet open to participation and collaboration from those coming from whatever direction who are willing to be open and in relationships of learning in deep relationship with restorative justice. So that I'll leave it there so we have just a few more minutes to open the floor to questions, but that's what the book attempts to accomplish, and I really find it helpfully illuminated and pushed forward by these wonderful contributions. So thank you very much. Questions from the floor, please. Anyone? Yeah.
Restorative justice includes correction with the cognitive transformal system. So my question is for either Professor Springs or Father Kelly. Are police and correction staff incorporating restorative justice? If so, how can it be done in a respectful way? And if not, why?
Good question.
What was that last thing you said?
And if not, why?
So ultimately, what you want to do is create a safe space for everybody in whatever space you're gathering. And so if it can be safe and people come as, Dave Kelly versus Father Dave Kelly with my title and my power, then you can create a space where that can happen. We do drumming circles in juvenile detention center, and using drums because young people are told to sit down, shut up, and be quiet. So what better way to give them a drum and, let's go at it and do some rhythm, connect in a different kind of way. And in those spaces, oftentimes there was, and these young people invited them, a correctional officer. But the correctional officer had to come in as a participant, as one of whatever the numbers are, and speak from I language. A lot of times we as adults like to say you, and you should do this, and you should be about this, and it's all, instead of speaking in I language, like this is my experience, this is what I see. And I think in those kinds of settings, you can create a space where that is safe. What you don't want to do is one of the things about peacemaking circle, which is one of the practices, is confidentiality. And that what you say in that space has to stay in that space, and people have to agree to that. And you go through, especially if it's a new circle, you go through the values and guidelines of a circle. And then everybody through consensus agrees to those and holds to those. And I'm amazed at how much confidentiality and some of the values of circles stays in place even outside that space.
I'll quickly speak to this. There's a chapter in the book in which I recount my the first 4-day circle training that I went through, which was this was back in 2015, December of 2015. And by the middle part of the each day it goes from like 9 to 3 or 3:30. And so it's very intense over the course of 4 days, and you're in there with a group of people being trained. So it's all the principles of circles, but you're practicing. And we found out halfway through the second unit of the first day that half the people being trained in there were plainclothes police officers. And, this was intentional by the organization that sponsored the training. They were doing this on purpose to try to see it. How would it work? Could they make it work? Would all the people give up the respective forms of power that they have, as Father Dave puts it, to trust the process enough to let it have this impetus to change and through this training. And it was hard. It was difficult. And but as I lay out in the chapter, I really am convinced that it was that it was an important way successful, but it required precisely what Father Dave just described. And it led to, by the third day and then the fourth day, some extremely difficult conversations that, to be frank, I expected at the time to be explosive. We did have from the very beginning, at least one participant who said, I can't be a part of this. Nobody told me there were going to be cops here. I can't do this, and had to leave. And she had very valid, legitimate reason. She was a community organizer who had experienced police brutality directly. She told her story and then wasn't able to come back the second day. And then the police officers, by the third day, into the third day, they wanted to process that in a way that they understood to exemplify accountability, holding her accountable for what they experienced as a kind of dismissal or prejudice. And it was working through that I thought anytime I encounter a conversation like this, it usually becomes explosive and degenerates into a kind of counterproductivity. But I was shocked at how an extremely difficult and challenging, talk about difficult conversations, a term we like to use now. We need to have a difficult conversation, right? A lot of times that just means it's going to get unproductive real quick, or somebody's going to stop listening, or people are going to raise their voices. But through the methodology and over the course of several hours, and on the basis of several extended days of relationship building that had already gone on, I was actually shocked. I was like, oh, nothing good is going to come from this. And yet the difficult things that were said and spoken and genuinely heard, I believe, were, I say in the book, it's a small, tiny example, but it's a powerful, important example of what's possible. And so that's one of the ways in which I think the process and the practice and how it's embodied there. There's so many ways to kind of do it in a way that's shallow or cookie cutter, or say, hey, we see it be successful here. Let's just get together and do this here. And I think I know that gets it wrong, gets the spirit wrong, gets the practice wrong. It's very unrestorative very quickly. But I wanted to lay that out in a chapter of the book in order to challenge any kind of easy opposition, dichotomous opposition. Others, any others?
Can I add to that? So
Yeah, sure.
Father Dave got me thinking, one of the early potential stumbling blocks for us with the corrections folks was that we use first names only. That's for confidentiality and for personalism. That's just how we do it. Corrections folks use last names, or they use, ID numbers and things. There's intentionally to depersonalize and to reinforce hierarchy, but that was a non-starter for us. You have to be allowed to be, the inside incarcerated men have to be able to call you by your first name, and they kind of cringe, but they showed up. That may sound small, but rhetorically, the small steps sometimes, say if we can survive that, we can keep going. It matters.
Good question.
Thank you all so much for your reflections. I had a question about the limitations on the potential collective and structural changes that we might see through this move towards restorative justice. So I'm thinking of in Colombia, in response to the conflict, they've adopted a restorative approach to justice. And I think on the sort of individual or group level between perpetrators and victims and parties involved, we do see an acceptance of this, I suppose, legitimacy of the restorative model. But on a wider societal level, I think there's a lot of skepticism and a feeling that retributive justice is still the way forward. Do you think these sort of interactions can have wider implications going beyond the groups involved? How do we move towards that? Yeah, I'd love to just have your reflections on that.
I'll respond quickly if you don't mind. Quick for me usually means about 8 minutes. I think the reception started just a minute ago, so anybody who wants to get up and go is welcome to. No, I will try to keep it short. But I mean, I think again, what I learned from Father Dave and so many of the folks at Precious Blood was what comes to my mind in response to a question like that is first of all, number one, what goes into cultivating a change in culture kind of in a deeper and more expansive and embracing sense, not just practice, not just rules, not just process, the way people, but the way of seeing, right? And Father Dave mentioned that Howard Zare wrote a book on it, Changing Lenses, very famous thing that, the camera lens that you see differently through that. But that takes time, and it's a process. It's a slow process. And time and again in my interviews, I was told by not just folks at Precious Blood, but numerous of the other hubs that I interviewed, that people have begun paying attention because of the degree of success in X, Y, and Z. This way it's successful. They kind of key in on the recidivism. And as a result, many of the hubs kind of refuse to work with that as a metric because it's kind of a loaded metric. And there's problems with it, but it gets a lot of people's attention. And once the people begin to pay attention and begin to lean in and say, hey, something seems to be going really well here. There's a process, process of change in the culture is a process of re-educating or educating those people who pay attention. So I heard the phrase time and again, well, we have people who want to fund this, but they also want to dictate the terms by which they measure it and understand it. And we want to work with them and be in restorative relationship with them, but we have to educate our funders so they come over time to understand differently. Am I getting that more or less right? I heard it from you. I heard it from countless others at numerous of the hubs. So it's this organic process of change where people but you have to begin by getting people's attention and kind of letting them come where they are and not being rejective of that, but recognizing, hey, well, it's very restorative in disposition to meet the person where they are and say, in what ways do we need to be in transition? How in particular can we educate them to understand differently what this needs to be about in order to have this transformation? Like otherwise, there are great risks of it being kind of co-opted or rejected out of hand or misunderstood from the start. So,
Can I just quickly add to that also, that also happening at the same time is that locking people up was very profitable. And at the same time, also putting people away gives people a place for moral outrage. And restorative justice kind of like removes that place for moral outrage. And so people make billions of dollars, as he points out in the book, out of locking folks up and also creating the imaginary that if someone who steals a car is still in your community, then you're in danger, when that's not necessarily the case, right? So we can keep folks afraid, we can keep them fractured, and we can keep making money, right? People make a lot of money out of it because if it was working well, locking people up, why do the numbers keep going up, right? Why do people keep doing it, right? And so the recidivism works well for people who are invested in it and what that social threat is, right? We create new threats. Michelle Alexander talks about that in the new Jim Crow, that we create new threats by locking people up because we also attach to the body and to their pathway the mark of a criminal record, where we keep them from being able to have certain housing, certain jobs, living certain places, which increases the likelihood that they'll go back in as well. So it's like so much is happening all at once that has to be addressed all at once as well.
okay, well, with that, class dismissed. I hope that you can make it to the reception.
Nice meeting you.